All right, so welcome everyone. My name is Cameron Soltis, and on behalf of the Halton Humanist Community and Café Scientifique Mississauga, welcome to our event. I think most of you have found us through Meetup or have been to our prior events, but if you haven't, please follow up us on Meetup so you can see our future events. And if you're interested in supporting events like this, please consider becoming a member of our group, the Halton Humanist Community, at hp-hc.ca and then clicking join us. Today, I'm happy to announce our guest speaker, Dr. Christopher Dicarlo. This is the third time that Dr. Dicarlo has talked to us. He had some previous talks about critical thinking in schools and the evolution of critical thinking. Dr. Dicarlo is a philosopher, an educator, and author. He often teaches in the Faculty of Philosophy at University of Toronto, Scarborough, and the Life Institute at Ryerson University. He's a lifetime member of Humanist Canada and expert advisor for Centre for Inquiry Canada. And today, Dr. Dicarlo will be talking to us about critical thinking and relatedly, his best-selling book, How to Become a Really Good Pain in the Ass, which has recently had a new edition out. So please, everyone, put your virtual hands together for Dr. Christopher Dicarlo. Take it away.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, so I'm just going to share my screen with you guys.
Please.
Or is this supporters of the BBC are feeling today? Oh my.
Right. Good stuff. All right, so there's a second edition of my book that's come out, and it's a bit of an interesting story. By the way, this just means how to be, really good pain in the ass. So that's, maybe I'll get a license plate with that on it. So here's the look of the second edition. What had happened was this book was published with Prometheus Books back in 2011. And then in 2020, I had an agent who signed me with Rowman and Littlefield for this So You Think You Can Think book. What had happened was, if you look very carefully, Rowman and Littlefield, they purchased Prometheus Books. So they're now owned by a larger publishing company that just happens to be my current publisher. So an editor contacted me and said, hey, this thing's got some legs. Would you be interested in a second edition? You can write some new material for it and whatnot. And I thought, yeah, sure, absolutely. So this will be coming out in November to mark the 10th anniversary year of its first being launched. So it was a bit of an honor. And so I've written a new introduction to this book, and I'll go through some of that with you tonight. And I don't want it to go too long because, you know, I like the Q&A part of the talk the most. So as you know, they said, reflect on the last decade. You know, how have you found, you know, the last decade? And I thought, well, you know, there's many reasons for writing that book when I did with such a title. But now, 10 years after, I consider, you know, looking at the current state of the world now compared to what it was in 2011, there seems to be an even more urgent need for this particular book. What I see us witnessing today is this kind of manic form of demonstration, not only of great progress, but also there's been a bit of an anti-scientific and even an anti-logic movement on some levels. And this seems to be occurring, you know, simultaneously. On the one hand, you know, over the last 10 years, we see the first, you know, Black president elected for 2 terms. We see CRISPR-Cas9 technology, you know, these genetic interventions, which will allow modern science, you know, to do amazing work in the treatment of numerous diseases, including, you know, cancer, and of course, even with COVID-19 and other viruses that affect humans. a lot has gone on in the past decade. We've seen rockets that essentially take off and then re-land with remarkable precision and efficiency, while at the same time, we see the 45th president of the United States deliberately spreading false information, which seems to have led, to this violent insurrection at the Capitol building on January 6th, 2021. What we saw happen in the world was something my colleagues and I have been warning about for decades with both Chinese and Canadian governments. And that was an entirely predictable pandemic, which shut down the world in many respects. And it's the reason why we're not meeting in person tonight. For years and years, my colleagues and I have been warning, that it's not a matter of if, but when, and to what extent is our Canadian government ready for this kind of thing. We now, hindsight being 2020 for these people, they're seeing certain patterns emerge that were entirely predictable. My company, Critical Thinking Solutions, back in March of 2020, approached both governments at the provincial and federal level to be consultants. Got the thank you, but we'll take it from here. And we've seen where some of that has led us. In the most recent part of the last 10 years, we've witnessed a fascinating phenomenon that is as frightening as it is fascinating, and that's QAnon, this conspiracy theory group, which is unique to conspiracy theories. So I have a book coming out, hopefully by the holiday season, called How to Talk to a Conspiracy Theorist. And my research into that, and with other scholars around the world, what we were noticing is QAnon is kind of unique in one respect, because it has no real actual foundational basis to reality. It's something that was written as a B action movie type of thing, and yet there are an enormous number of Americans who subscribe to this particular conspiracy theory or aspects of it, and that's not just the kind of general public, right? But that's 36 QAnon supporters are running for Congress in 2022, and there they are. And some you'll be familiar with, Lauren Boebert and Marjorie Taylor Greene. Over a quarter of them are from the state of Florida, but not to pick on any particular state. It's uncanny to me that just about anybody can be elected into office. You don't have to demonstrate any capacity for critical thought or demonstrate that you don't believe this type of stuff. I guess that's freedom of speech in action for political candidates, I guess, sure, all right. But do you want people in positions of power voting on laws that will regulate you who subscribe to a conspiracy theory that has no basis in reality? That doesn't bode well, I think, for those particular districts, those regions within America. But nonetheless, here we are. We have entered into this new age, what I call the age of post-truth, where things like alternative facts, personal feelings, these types of things, they matter as much as in the political and public arenas as actual facts do. And the fact that I have to make a distinction between alternative facts and actual facts ironically demonstrates the absurd level to which our means of communication have devolved. And that's a fact. It's unfortunate that these things have come along, but here we are. And over the last several years, there's been this gradual but definite decline, kind of an erosion of the relevance of facts and logic and critical thinking, self-reflection, accountability. These things in some circles are looked upon with derision. They're not celebrated, but they are considered to be, standing in the way of, liberty and human rights and freedoms and that sort of thing. So all of these things and other manner of values, we ought to hold these things in the highest regard when discussing important issues. And they've been eroded, over the past 10 years. And what this has done is with these, ideological polarization in the US anyhow, between Democrats and Republicans, but we're seeing it in Canada, we're seeing it in India, we're seeing it in Brazil, we're seeing it in Eastern Europe and other places. We're seeing authoritarian political parties gaining momentum through these various countries. And there's these disputes that are going on throughout the rest of the world. And we're at a point in history where this notion of civility continues to be eroded to a point where the public is kind of collectively, we're scratching our collective heads, wondering, how do we get here? And here we are, nonetheless. And I think the question we need to ask ourselves is, we're here. What are we going to be doing about this? Much of the problem, I think, can be found in the way in which information is now distributed, how it's interpreted, how people act upon it, and especially online. One of the things I point out in one of the chapters in the conspiracy book is that there is an episode of process over the last 20 years, which I think really, added to this kind of devolution of respect for critical thinking. And that is the simultaneous inverse proportion between the erosion of journalistic integrity and the rise of social media, these things happening simultaneously. And that has given a great environment, a very rich environment for people to be able to say whatever they want. Do you go to a trusted news service? No, go to your influencer. Let's see what Kim Kardashian has to say about this, or, Nicki Minaj's big bald cousin's friend. Why don't we check in on how COVID's doing in Trinidad? Let's go to an influencer. Let's not go to the news. So we're seeing that simultaneously inverse proportional relationship between the demise of journalistic integrity. And I'm not blaming journalists. I'm blaming people who own major news services like newspapers and others that allow for this type of activity to occur. And then social media to take off, where a huge percentage of the world's population gets their information from Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. So maybe we shouldn't be overly surprised that this is happening, but happening it is. Now that we're kind of aware of that and we can educate ourselves about the processes behind what's going on in the world, we can ask ourselves, okay, what are we going to be doing about this? So I think unlike any other time in history, we are inundated with information, and maybe this is a bad thing, maybe because we have it with our cell phones 24/7, and we know that there are addictions to cell phones, that this is quite common, that people get dopaminergic rushes, almost like cocaine hits when they find certain things on their phones that reconfirms their already established confirmation biases. We know the neurology behind it. We know the physiology behind it. So then what are we doing about it, right? That's the question. So we're racing to catch up to what's reliable sources of media that are dependable, that are true. And, all the while we have this very powerful, these emotional attachments to our personal understanding of various issues. And, we look at things like inherent algorithms within certain social platforms that give you and constantly feed you the information that already confirms your pre-established biases. So you're seeing something, but the person living with you, has their different set of biases, and the algorithms that find out what it is you're clicking on most just keep feeding you that information, right? And so it's not surprising that we're more connected digitally than we ever have been before, and yet we're in these silos. We're being kept apart from each other. and being fed our own information that satisfies these biases. Now, in the last 10 years, we've lost this capacity in dialogue for what we might call the art of disagreement. And a lot of people have lost the capacity to have face-to-face intelligent discussions and be able to disagree and still be able to get along. There's sharply divided lines drawn both geographically and ideologically. And we need to get back to a place of security, of universal acceptance of these common rules of discourse and dependability of information accuracy. But this confidence will only be established and maintained when we can recognize and accept, the power and importance of these tools of critical thinking. I think now more than ever, the time is right for critical thinking to be front and center in all of our educational institutions, from kindergarten to postdoctoral levels. If we're wondering why the world is the way it is today, where political polarization has created a kind of a far left woke generation and a far right post-truth alternative facts generation, you really need to look no further than what I believe are our failing education systems. I think they've lost the capacity to train students to be able to think critically. It's not simply our education systems. I think we have to teach these skills at all different levels: civil servants, politicians, medical staff, you name it, especially in the business communities. With a world population of over 7 billion, we cannot hope to get along unless and until we agree to abide by these kind of fundamental and universal laws of civil disagreement and dialogue. And this requires a type of collective agreement to use this accepted skill set of critical thinking. And so I consider this book, as I did 10 years ago, I consider it still to be a Socratic mission. Right? Socrates was on a mission to try to get people to think more carefully, more critically, more reflectively about why it is they believe what they did. And this can bring greater clarity and agreement to the world through respectful dialogue that abides by these principles, rules, and laws of critical thinking. So there are hundreds of books available that deal with ways to improve our thinking. In this case, I wanted to write a book that contained information that would stay with the reader years after they read it. And so that's the reason why I divided it into these kind of 3 distinct but related parts. And the book can actually be read as 3 different books. The first part, as many of you will know, deals with basically the tools of what I call the critical thinking skill set. It's for every individual to be able to learn and understand and apply these. So I decided to distill the most basic and important critical thinking skills down into their kind of component parts and put them in this handy mnemonic so that we just have to remember the first 6 letters of the English alphabet. A is for argument, B is for bias, C is for context, D is for diagramming, E is for evidence, and F is for fallacies. And I'm happy to say that there are a number of university professors that are using this book in some of their courses. And I'll be dealing with a professor from Michigan State University on Thursday to address his class. And they're using this for one of their courses called Science, Pseudoscience, and Bullshit. And I thought I was quite honored that they were using this particular book as their text. Each one of those tools provides any reader with the capacity to better understand why they believe what they do, how they came to believe that, and then to be prepared to question how their beliefs affect their actions. And this is really the central concept of critical thinking. Why do you now believe what you do? and to what extent do you act on what you believe? People can believe all kinds of information, but would never act on it. But for those who act on those beliefs, how did you come to get that particular point of view? These tools provide the skill set, which I think empowers anyone to basically organize their thoughts better, more clearly, more consistently, more confidently. And then this allows people to more effectively communicate their thoughts. Part of the problem is people talk, people interpret. They sometimes interpret correctly, they sometimes misinterpret, and then they attack the misinterpretation, known as a straw man. What we're trying to push in critical thinking is to steel man the person's perspective. Why? Because that's what we would expect them to do to our perspective. Don't misrepresent us and then attack a misrepresentation. Is that fair? Would you do that with your friends, your family member, your spouse? Why would you do that? That's such a huge waste of time. We sometimes call that question period in Parliament. It can be just a huge waste of time. And politicians often deliberately misinterpret what their opponents or people across the aisle are saying. Well, that's a huge waste of taxpayer money. We need to flip the paradigm around and say, let me try to understand what it is you're saying. And you let me know if I've got it right. If that's all we have to do to demonstrate to the other person that we are willing to listen to them, then maybe that goes a long way to demonstrating to people that we care about diversity of opinion, that we care about the idea that we want, a heterodoxy rather than an orthodoxy, that we like a diversity of opinions, but that those opinions, those views, those beliefs have to abide by certain rules. And that's what we learn in critical thinking. You can't just say anything and hope that it should be accepted just because that's how you feel. Yeah, emotions are a powerful part of the human condition, but critical thinking allows us to step back from those emotions, to think more carefully about how we arrived at those particular conclusions. And so this book has always been my Socratic mission to try to bring that as far and wide as I possibly could. Now, the intentionality, as I mentioned, of what we speak and how that's interpreted often can lead to confusion and disagreement and anger and hatred. So we want to get rid of that. We want to make sure that the intentionality is interpreted as clearly as possible in regards to what an individual wanted or desired. And this obviously increases the likelihood then of being understood. We may not always agree, we're going to have disagreements, but if we can articulate and communicate our thoughts and ideas more effectively, I think this is going to go a long way towards a more civilized form of discussion. Otherwise, we're just going to be talking past each other. We're going to be blinded by our own biases, potentially our own ignorance. And we're never going to come to the types of resolutions that allow us to get the most out of what we want in any kind of society or political establishment. The second part of the book basically focuses on the works of Socrates and the ancient skeptics. And I think it's important to remember how valuable these works were and continue to be in appreciating methods that we can all employ in an effort to hold those people who might be in power accountable for their beliefs and actions. What I did this election is essentially I called up every political office in the city. There's 7 parties and 7 candidates running. And outside of the usual 4, there was the Communist Party, the Animal Welfare Party, and the PPC, People's Party of Canada. I called up all the offices to talk to the candidates. And I asked them each the same question. I don't want a speech. If we handed you the keys to the country, what are the first 5 things you would do? What are your top 5 priorities? Don't give me a speech. And I don't want a long detail, just bing, bing, bing. Just give me the 5. And then I put them into a PowerPoint presentation, and I shone it off of my garage. I live on a main street in Guelph, so that people walking and driving by, and I just looped the thing hour after hour after hour. So if you're going to the polls, here's what all the candidates in Guelph believe are the 5 most important things that their parties want to accomplish. So when you go to the polls, at least we're a little more knowledgeable. And after the election has finished, all the votes are counted, then we can take those 5 and we can hold politicians accountable. You said you were going to do this. These are the 5 things. So now you're in office. To what extent are you going to do these 5 things? Not to pick on any particular candidate. I think they are not great candidates. They're not great leaders. And I'm not a huge advocate for party politics. I think it divides people and erodes the polis, because you have to toe the company line. And if you're liberal, you can't accept a great idea from somebody else. If you're conservative, whatever, party politics aside, it was just my way of trying to do some kind of civic duty so that we can, be a little bit more knowledgeable going to the polls, and then we can hold these people accountable afterwards. The last election, you might remember, Mr. Trudeau said, proportional representation in voting. Absolutely, let's do that. First thing he got rid of when he got into office, proportional representation. Now, agree with it, don't agree with it, that's another talk entirely. But it did seem a little off, but be that as it may. Here we are now at the end of another election. Not a whole lot has changed, but we're back into this particular situation, and hopefully we can get through this pandemic and come out, and everybody will have not been inconvenienced too much by this particular election. So here we have the works of Socrates and the ancient skeptics. And if we do not act in the ways in which these great philosophers acted, that they could hold the feet of people in authority, positions of authority to the fire, then what we might do is we're going to find ourselves living in societies that don't value these things that we used to value, or people have valued, facts and truth and knowledge, and all these things that go into making what a democracy is supposed to be, which is a very kind of fragile state of being for any political environment or civilization. It's these types of things that are at the basis of any functioning democracy. And when you start getting rid of these things, you start eroding down those democratic principles, you start getting more into kind of autocratic or even despotic or tyrannical types of situations. And that's why, because these things then are ignored, and they don't usually happen very drastically. They're eroded over time. And just in the 10 years since the first edition came out, I think it's safe to say that we've seen a lot of these virtues become more and more eroded in order for people to just gain access to positions of power. Well, if we don't stand up, we're just going to watch this, society continue to erode in this particular way. So around the world, we're seeing evidence of divided nations talking past one another, refusing to even entertain the possibility that their side could, in some minor way, be in error. So these are dangerous times, certainly more dangerous now than they were just 10 years ago. There seem to be too many countries in the world today run by leaders who really have no intention of abiding by these commonly accepted rules of civilized discourse, grounded in the skill set of critical thinking. And these were developed by these great thinkers, these philosophers from over 2 millennia ago. They held people accountable for their beliefs. And they did this through things like the Socratic method, the capacity to question people about what they believed, and then getting them to try to recognize inconsistencies and contradictions in the positions that they held. And then the skeptical modes, the capacity for knowing what your limitations are, being limited in making certain knowledge claims about the way the world actually is, and saying with absolute certainty. These are the gray areas and the nuanced areas that we're not seeing applied, certainly by certain states and governors in certain states in the United States, where certain values supersede others, like liberty and freedom to do pretty much whatever you want. People don't quite understand the John Stuart Mill and John Locke notions of liberty, where your liberty ends at my harm and my liberty ends at your harm. People are blurring that. They're not quite understanding what it means to be free, and that's unfortunate. But they were great examples of what it meant to be a really good pain in the ass. And that's why the book is called that, because nobody likes just a pain in the ass, but to be a really good one is to get people in positions of power to be more reflective and thoughtful and careful and critical about why they accept certain policies, certain ideas, and then act on those. And by knowing these critical thinking tools and the skill set, we can hold those people to account. Now, it's predominantly because of Socrates and the ancient skeptics that obviously the book is named what it is. And that's why today, more than ever, society needs people, lots of them, to be really good pains in the ass. By asking the types of questions that hold these people accountable. We cannot even begin to speak truth to power unless we collectively become familiar and practice the skill set of critical thinking. Now, I do not have the rights to show this particular painting of Norman Rockwell, so his estate can sue me if they want, but look at what a great demonstration this is. This is called freedom of speech. Here we have obviously it's like a town meeting of some sort, but notice all the people in ties and suits here. And then this kind of blue collar gentleman, you see this blue kind of pamphlet of the agenda of whatever the meeting is. He's got it tucked up in his coat here. You see his hands are kind of unwashed. He works with his hands. These other guys, their hands are nice and clean. They got the manicured fingernails and all that kind of stuff. But nobody is looking at what this man is saying with great disdain. Look at how Rockwell put all of these eyes looking at what this man is saying in interest, as though, here's a guy who comes with a whole different set of biases. Here's a blue collar guy in a white collar world here, and he's giving us his opinion. And we've been stuck in our kind of white collar silo here. And now we're being introduced to this. We're being, okay, so maybe this guy's got something to say. So there's no anger and how dare you disagree with what we believe in. It's more like a kind of almost curiosity and intellectual desire to learn more from what another person's world perspective might happen to be. This is what we've lost, and Rockwell captured this perfectly here. We have to get back to this. We've gotten away from listening to everybody and what their particular views are through their lenses, through their biases, where they come, to what do they bring to the table? What do they bring to the game, as it were? And I've always loved this painting because it shows that so well of how we should be acting when others have points of view that differ from ours. And so sue me all you want, but I think this is just a great example of what I think the attitude of society should be like if we exercised critical thinking skills on a daily basis in all aspects of our lives. And then part 3, of course, deals with what I call the big 5. These are the most important questions. So the book is subtitled, A Critical Thinker's Guide to Asking the Right Questions. So often I find that people don't ask these questions. And this is what gets us in trouble, because people say, my mother used to say, when in mixed company, don't talk about politics, sex, or religion. Those are the three bad things you should never talk about. But those are the most important and the most interesting ones. And when it comes to the big five, right, what can I know? Why am I here? What am I? How should I behave? And what is to come of me? These collectively make up the meaning of life. You want to ask yourself, well, what's the meaning of life? You answer these questions. If, I've mentioned this before, if you're in a speed dating situation where you get to sit down and find out as much about a person in a minute as possible, what do you do for a living? What kind of music do you like? What type of food do you like? Okay, yeah, where do you work? What do you? Just ask them any or all of these. You'll find out a lot about a person by how they answer or respond to these questions, because basically they can be responded to entirely on a natural level, entirely on a supernatural level, or some form of hybrid of both. But just when you ask somebody, what are the limits of your knowledge? If a person ever says, I know for sure my God exists and my God wants me to behave in a particular way, and okay, so you've lost them kind of to dogmatism. Do they have the reflective capacity to even admit that they might be wrong? If they don't, right, this is the question, is there any evidence that could convince you that you might be wrong in what you now believe or what you claim to know? And if they say no, I think this is a greater question for us to ask. How do we get to those people so that they're more aware of the reality of human ignorance, that our lives are, pervasive, ignorance is everywhere. And to me, it was a huge turning point in the cultural evolution of human intelligence for the skeptics and Socrates to say, hey, none of us know this stuff for real. Like, none of us know what the absolute truth is. Otherwise, we would all believe it. We wouldn't have to, there would be no philosophy, right? If we all knew what was absolutely true. Even in the realm of science, information is held as provisional always, because the future might demonstrate that there's evidence of some form that we hadn't considered, that we now have to alter our perspectives. Why do you think things are going on, especially in the US, with COVID, when they say, Fauci told us not to wear masks, he's a flip-flopper? No. Fauci didn't know that COVID was asymptomatic at the time he made that statement. With the original SARS, if some of you will remember back in 2003, those who had it had symptoms. The reason why we are having this meeting by Zoom is because SARS-CoV-2 is asymptomatic. That's a game changer. And what my colleagues and I warned countries about: long incubation periods for viruses and asymptomatic cases. Once Fauci found out, there's you might remember that cruise ship that was stopped in the harbor, and they interviewed one guy and he said, I've proven positive and I feel great. That's when my colleagues and I realized, not good. So science changes its conclusions as new evidence emerges. If it didn't, that's what dogma is about. Science has to be flexible. Science has to always leave the door open for the possibility that its ideas might change, that its conclusions could possibly change. Right? And look at the rest of these questions. Why am I here? What am I? You can answer these entirely naturalistic. How should I behave? That's the entire field of ethics. How should we behave towards our own species and other species? What is to come of me? That is to say, now in this life, depending on the decisions I make. And for those people, who believe, when we die, what is to come of me? Some will say nothing's going to happen. Others are like, oh no, we're going to a great place. It's a far greater place. So when we find out how people answer these questions, we learn an awful lot about them. It'd be interesting if we just had to wear, these little, stickers that just answered those 5 questions. So we could just walk up to a person and say, oh, hi, your name's Frank, and you You know, believe you can know absolute truth. You're here because God wanted you to be. You're a spiritual being in a physical body. You should behave according to what your God maintains. And if you act in a certain way, you're going to, I don't know, heaven, happy hunting ground, nirvana, Valhalla, whatever, right? And if everybody had those, we would cut a lot of time down on understanding why they think the way they do about, say, abortion, as we're seeing in Texas now with the changing of laws, perhaps gun control. I'm pretty convinced we could put together a system that could predict human ideology and behavior just on these 5 questions alone and how people answer them. But I do think they're extremely important. And I do think that those questions tell us a great deal about who we are. And I think much of the world's difficulties today are directly or indirectly the result of the different ways in which people answer those 5 questions. And over the past 5,000 years, how humans have answered them has led to our current state that we are living in today. I sincerely believe every human on this planet were able to discuss the manner in which they answer those questions. And we did this fairly in accordance to the critical thinking skill set. There would be a lot less hatred and anger and violence and bloodshed throughout the world because we would have a far greater understanding of our differences of viewpoints. And we wouldn't be demonizing them because they don't belong to our particular club. So it's really important that we exercise our capacity to establish what these critical thinking rules are, and then to be able to abide by them. Now, this might seem like wishful thinking. I believe we have a moral imperative. William Kingdon Clifford, an English mathematician, believed this is the ethics of belief. This is called epistemic responsibility. We have a moral imperative in gaining information about ourselves and the world, which will then foster more civilized and intelligent discussions, no matter how emotionally attached to the issues we might become. If we avoid doing this, we might do so at our own peril, and we're starting to see that as each day passes. So if we are to survive as a species and live in a world of differing ideological and political and moral and religious beliefs, then we have to have the intellectual maturity and the respect to be able to discuss not only the big 5, but all important issues. We have to be able to do this candidly and honestly. And we must not be pressured by ideologies either from the left or the right in terms of what is sacrosanct or what's off the table for discussion. For if we know how to utilize the tools of our critical thinking skill set, then we should have no real concerns about how to have intelligent discussions in a civilized manner regarding any and all topics. It follows then that the practice of critical thinking skills is really the cornerstone for both freedom of thought and freedom of speech. It is for these reasons and more that we need to introduce critical thinking into all levels of education. If children were taught how to fairly engage in discussions and dialogue about important issues from the time that they were very young, this will stay with them for the rest of their lives and will undoubtedly lead to greater conflict resolutions, better decision-making, greater problem solving, and overall a more civilized world in which we need not fear discussing important issues, for fear of triggering in safe spaces and offending people and whatnot. But we, not just the opposite, we'll be empowered how to do this in an intelligent manner. Look, critical thinking is our greatest hope for the future of humankind. Unlike any other subject, we don't leave critical thinking in the classroom or in the office or in the home or in any other place. It follows us out the door and it permeates every aspect of our being. It's not like Windows 95, where it becomes obsolete and replaced by more evolved and developed forms of information technology. Instead, the skill of critical thinking is permanent, it's universal, and it is unchanging. It applies to everyone around this world. What will the next 10 years look like? I'm cautiously optimistic. I believe we should look at Carl Sagan's prescient and shockingly accurate view of contemporary American culture, and that this should be an intellectual call to arms, right? I have a foreboding, many of you will be familiar with this, of an America in my children's or grandchildren's time, when the United States is a service and information economy, when nearly all the manufacturing industries have slipped away to other countries, when awesome technological powers are in the hands of a very few, no one representing the public interest can even grasp the issues, when the people have lost the ability to set their own agendas or knowledgeably question those in authority, when clutching our crystals and nervously consulting our horoscopes, our critical faculties in decline, unable to distinguish between what feels good and what's true, we slide almost without noticing back into superstition and darkness. The dumbing down of America is most evident in the slow decay of substantive content in the enormously influential media, the 30-second sound bites now down to 10 seconds or less, lowest common denominator programming, credulous presentations on pseudoscience and superstition, but especially a kind of celebration of ignorance. We can rely on critical thinking skills to lead us to the most responsible ways in which we can interpret, understand, and act on information. And we must never forget that critical thinking isn't simply something you do, it's what you live. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Dicarlo. And everyone can, I think they're all clapping virtually again. All right. I think we'll open it up now to questions. Anyone have any questions? Looking for anyone who wants to come off mute or raise their hand. Well, while everyone else gets them ready, I'm going to steal one from, I think Chris and Linda were having a discussion in the chat during the talk, and Chris made a comment that made me think, is there a difference between people who are anti-logic and people who don't recognize their own cognitive biases, or is it kind of a intentional, purposeful, decide not to recognize them?
That's a great question. It's tough to determine that because there are no surveys where you can get people to admit honestly what they were doing. So we just have to watch and collectively try to enumerate, when that is happening as a kind of collective. We know in groupthink that this has happened. There's plenty of psychological studies where even when people are making observances of certain conditions that are going on, and they put in a bunch of test subjects along with control, like people who are actually in on the test itself, and they see how conforming people will be, even when it's absurd. So the one example is there's 3 sticks that go by. Are they all the same length, or are they different? And some are clearly, like, one will be exaggeratedly longer than the other, but 5 people in a row will say they're the same, and then the test subject will just say the same, because he doesn't want to rock the boat. People hate confrontation in some senses, right? And so they'll just kind of go along and whatnot. They might secretly think differently, but they will publicly present in a particular way. In case you're wondering, this is what has happened to a lot of humanities and social science faculties in academia. And that is, people thought one way, but openly they just kind of agreed with everything. And so more and more critical thinking got eroded away for political ideology. And if you're wondering how the whole kind of woke movement came into being, it did so gradually. I was a victim of it with several universities back in the early and mid 2000s. literally with one group claiming to be critical criminologists. You'll hear the term critical a lot: critical justice theory, critical race theory, critical criminology, where this term critical from critical thinking has been hijacked and actually means almost the opposite in some cases of being critical. Where critical criminology tries to understand crime, it does so only through the lens of feminism and Marxism. And I'm not saying those aren't important, but surely crime is a much more nuanced and complex factor of societies that cannot simply be explained by the fact that men are in power and capitalism, it reigns supreme. Is that the only reason why there's crime? There's no crime in other places that don't see that as much, you know? And so it's difficult, I guess, when people are locked in to a worldview, to an ideology. Anything that is even remotely different from that particular position is seen as anathema, as seen as, and if you happen to be just philosophical, like I was in one faculty, and said, well, what about biology? Aren't there biological constraints? I got the hand, right? I literally had a hand put in my face, and the person said, we don't do that evolutionary stuff. I said, oh, so humans popped into existence ex nihilo. They just poof, they just came here. And so there's no biological influence on human behavior at all. And the one faculty member said, maybe about 1%. And I said, so culture is responsible for 99% of human behavior. And they said, yes. I said, okay, what about homosexuality? All those people are choosing to be gay. Throughout history, people have been persecuted, sentenced to death, and they could have just chosen otherwise. And they're like, yes. I said, do you see how absurd that is, what you're saying? So, you know, within academia, I've seen it at its worst, where there's just a total refusal to consider another framework. I'm not even talking about an ideology here. Biology isn't an ideology. Biology is just scientific fact. But in the social sciences, it's pretty much chucked out the window. They don't care for it because they want things to be seen and practiced through their worldview. And while we're at it, I know I'm going on a bit of a Rick Mercer rant, but just call up any department, any sociology department, any philosophy department in Canada, the US, and say, how many right-wing professors do you have in your faculty? It's going to approach zero. Is that diversity of view? I mean, even if we disagree with these people, isn't that what we want? A heterodoxy? Don't we want to hear a variety of opinions? Academia in the humanities and sciences has gotten so far left now, and excuse me if I'm sounding a little more like Jordan Peterson, but he does have a bit of a point. He's seen it and I've watched it. We both watched this happen. So then, to take your question, how do we get to those people who are teaching thousands, hundreds of thousands of students who are now going out and doing protests and are taking this information from these very far left professors, so that when somebody makes a claim that might not be, you know, within their realm of ideology, they're seen as anathema. They're seen as, well, you must be a racist then, or a misogynist, patriarchal, horrible, because that's the language they've learned. And because of that, to even philosophically entertain the possibility of challenging current tenets, views, ideologies, whatever, you're canceled. So in case you guys are wondering how did we get here? I've been watching it happen for decades at the academic level. Now it's just trickled out into the world, into HR groups. You know, it's out there because nobody was doing anything. And if you tried, like I did, you got fired from 4 universities. So critical thinking, like the University of Toronto in Scarborough, I said, you guys, your philosophy department, you don't even have a course in critical thinking. Our students don't need it. What? Well, what do you mean they don't need it? Oh, it's kind of like through, it's transitive, kind of like through osmosis. They get it from the other courses that we teach. Really? I don't think they do. But yet, here we are. And I know this is a long-winded and roundabout way of answering your question, but I just don't know how else to deal with what's going on in my part of the world, but also, in other aspects. I'll never be hired. I can't imagine ever being hired at a university for the rest of my life. I'd be fired before lunch. There'd be no question about that. For trying to get students to be a little more critical about what they're being taught, about how the world functions, these types of things, I'd be gone, because I would trigger somebody, or another faculty member would hear, and that would be it. I'd be called in. I'd be forced to, try to give some type of apology or whatnot, and then I'd be out. So that's where we're at. So I don't know how to respond to try to get people to think more critically about why it is they believe what they do. And I'm sorry I don't have a better answer for you. I know it seems bleak, but it's not a great, academia is not a great place to be. Before I was fired from Guelph, one of my colleagues, a great professor, Jay Newman, philosophy professor, Brooklyn guy, said, "Dicarlo, I hate this place. I hate coming in here. This place is toxic." Early 2000s, he was saying that. So this place has gone to shit. Look at the people that they're hiring now. You can't say a thing. I got to watch my every word. I only come to this campus to teach, and then I go home. I don't want to have anything more. And he was a great man. He was a great educator. And he was funny. He was witty. He was erudite. He was a public intellectual. And they shut him down. He couldn't say a thing. That was early 2000s. This was going on. So you can imagine how bad it is now. So my apologies for the rant.
No, that's right. It's very in-depth response. Chris, I believe you had your hand up.
Yeah, I just think I appreciate what the doctor said here. I just think, from my point of view, you're conflating like two very different issues, or both very important issues. Mm-hmm. But I don't know, you can mix the two, right? So I think if we take the book on its face value, people gaining more skills and practice critical thinking, I think that's absolutely true and positive, and something that people should do. As if the lack of critical thinking, or the decline of critical thinking, is the driving force to, our, conflict in society. Mm-hmm. I actually think, people are just as capable or incapable of doing their critical thinking by percentage, right, on the population level, mm-hmm. as they ever were. But the things that we didn't address in the lecture is really the effect of the technology, right, and its ability to amplify a particular point of view, mm-hmm. versus before, I want to share my a particular conspiracy or particular way of looking at the world, I would need to read my book. I would need to, write a response in a newspaper, where now I can do that instantly, right? Which means that there's less time to think. So this is more, so instead of saying that people are not thinking, I think it's more of a paradigm change, right? That we're living in a world with this technology. Mm-hmm. And the technology drives a lot of these particular social reaction change. Yeah. And two, from an anthropology point of view too, right? Mm-hmm. If you look at society as they get more concentrated, meaning that there's more and more population in a specific area, and per person there are less and less resources. In general, the government always becomes less liberal and more top-down. That is true. You take any government, all the way back to the Sumerians and the Egyptians, through the Romans, and name any great empires. Mm-hmm. This is what happens whenever you have some quirks in some period in time where you do have some liberality is when a country was not a huge population, but all of a sudden had this tremendous amount of resources for a slight period of time, like the British Empire, the Spanish Empire, the American Empire, because we're able to go out and conquest all these people and get all their resources. So of course we, as a nation, per individual, you're going to have a little more freedom. But once everything stagnates, and we do have to share, government in general don't like a population with all these individual critical thinking views, right? I mean, I was kind of actually thought it was funny because you put the Socratic method up there. I mean, really, at the end, the majority or the principal reason why Socrates was put to death was because his practice of the Socratic method and his threat to the Athenian government at the time, right? Forget everything else ethically they were accusing him. That was the reason, right? So if you're in power, you're never going to practice this particular method honestly, because it doesn't serve you, right? You want people to listen to you and follow you fairly blindly without questioning, because if everybody's questioning you, you are not going to get your agenda down in a time that's acceptable, right? So I just think that you can't really mix it too. I think everybody should have critical thinking skills. Agreed. Mm-hmm. I don't think we have declined critical thinking skills, and I don't think the lack of critical thinking is our problem. Is more like, how do we deal with this very rapid change of technology? That's our problem.
Okay. So what I'm getting from that, Chris, are a couple of things. Technology is a factor, and so I've mentioned the the inverse proportional relationship between the decay of journalism or journalistic integrity and the rise of social media. So process has definitely generated a lot of what we're seeing today in terms of disputes, how people behave and whatnot. But in my books, I talk a fair bit about what's called media literacy, which is the capacity for people to be able to take the information they find online and be able to research it to determine its level of truth. And so in this latest book, I give a number of resources, Snopes, PolitiFacts, a ton of different resources where people can say, is that true? Can I check on that? Because a lot of people click and forward and advance and retweet and whatnot, and they don't think through it because it gives them that dopaminergic, that buzz of confirmation, except, hey, this is great. It's confirming my bias. I got to send this along. I got to put this out. And so, yeah, we have to teach young people, media literacy. We have to teach them how and where to get reliably obtained information that provides evidence to our premises, which support our conclusions. And Chris, when you mentioned the second point about governments and whatnot, yeah, there are some cases where governments like to keep the polis dumb, stupid. They like to keep them and scared. Like fear and ignorance are great motivating factors to get people to agree to what you want to do. Governments throughout history love using fear and ignorance because you want to be secure. It's the number one thing humans need in their life, to feel secure. And when they don't, and things are unsettled, they want to get back to, this is what I call biological and mimetic equilibrium. They want to get a balance back in their life because like we wanted to do with this pandemic, we kept waiting for it to get over and over and over. And now we're dealing with these different issues and whatnot, and we're still meeting at a distance and whatnot. And so, if pushed too far, Chris, your point sounds like you're agreeing to Thrasymachus in Plato's Republic, which is might makes right. It's just whomever's in power, they get to call the shots. And if you disagree, they'll keep you down. They'll do whatever they have to do to get you to conform. And so Thrasymachus says, screw you, Socrates. All your talk of educating people and getting them to challenge, none of that matters, because whomever is in power, they get to call all the shots. And so it doesn't matter what philosophy they agree to or abide by, they can do whatever they want. And yes, that is correct. But in the birth of democracy in Greece, that's not correct. That's why democracy is a very fragile thing. And when it's working, man, it is a great thing to see. And there have been times throughout history, the golden age of politics, for example, in the 18th century England, where the House of Lords, you would have Jeremy Bentham, just a philosopher, walk in and present ideas, and both the right and the left saying, never looked at it that way. Yeah, that's interesting. Let's change the laws accordingly. And both sides agreeing for the greatest good of the polis, this golden age of politics. We can return to the ideals of democracy. But to me, the cornerstone of that are these tenets of critical thinking, because they're the last thing we have to appeal. What else is there other than logic? There's not. It's the foundation of all human reasoning. Logic is to politics what math is to science. You can't do science without measurable mathematics. And you shouldn't be able to do politics without a groundwork of logic and the basis of critical thinking. So I'm going to have to respectfully disagree with you on the on a couple of points there, that I do think if we can get this taught at a young enough age, because I think, by the time somebody's 18, 19, in their 20s, they might already be so grounded in dogma. It's a very much more difficult feat to try to get them to rethink their ideas. If we can teach critical thinking fairly to all students at a very young age, and it becomes just a part of their thinking process as they move throughout the school education programs, then they'll have the capacity, then they will be empowered to be able to voice their concerns, articulate their ideas in a much more efficacious or beneficial way. But we're a long way from that right now, but it's still something we can hope for.
Excellent. George?
I think, Dr. Dicarlo, you answered most of what I was going to say in the answer to the first question, but I'm going to ask you to focus on a certain angle. And what I mean by you answered, because I was going to ask you about the word critical. When you wrote your book 10 years ago, and probably thought about it before, the terms critical justice theory, critical gender theory, critical race theory were probably over there, but they were not commonly heard as they are today. Mm-hmm. So that probably presents a challenge to you, because not only do you disagree with those ideas, but many people who hear the word critical thinking, they might say, well, critical thinking is just one of those critical other things that we're talking about. So the first part of my question, have you ever thought of writing not a critique of those other critical this and that, but an explanation of what it is and what it is not? So that is the first thing that I'm going to ask you. Mm-hmm. The second thing is, I'm going to put 3 questions all along and you answer this. Like, I assume that you watched the Netflix series, The Chair, so you can comment on that if you like.
I know of it. Yeah, I haven't seen it yet, but I know.
Oh, okay. So then you don't have to say anything. And the third one, you said you are optimistic.
Yes.
And I think all of us would love to be optimistic, but I'm not sure I got what makes you optimistic.
Okay, so I'll start with the first. That would make a good op-ed, unless it's already been done, and I'm hopeful actually that it's been done. To distinguish critical thinking from the hijacked terms of critical criminology and these other kind of sub-disciplines and whatnot. I've even gone so far, George, as to I've thought about, do we just need to rebrand it? So instead of calling it critical thinking, call it clear thinking, call it, something else and whatnot. But no, we were here first. Like it really is critical that you're being critical of what people have to say. Critical criminology, they're not being critical, certainly not of their own philosophical viewpoints within that particular body of literature. They're not being critical at all. In fact, they're being just the opposite of it. So I will take that into consideration, maybe put it together into a kind of an op-ed, and see if it has any traction. The chair, I would love to see. I've heard a lot about it, and I'm sure it's not far from the truth. And some of the scenes I've read about and have learned about. And your third point was on optimism. I don't want to be overly optimistic, but I certainly don't want to be pessimistic, because I have seen the returns on critical thinking. What do I mean by that? Quite a few former students of mine have stayed in touch with me, and they do hold fairly interesting positions within society, positions of power and so on. And they are using the critical thinking skill set that they learned when I was their professor in their jobs. In fact, they say that's the one book I still have, is your How to Become a Really Good Pain in the Ass. And I refer to it a fair bit. So I'm optimistic that we can, I will try to meet with Minister Lecce, as I did with his predecessor, and started up the pilot project of critical thinking in high schools until the Liberals were voted out. And I know Mr. Lecce has his plate full with the pandemic and a lot of other things. But we have been staying in contact with him and his office to resume talks of getting critical thinking taught, at least in the high school curriculum. And then I have a client that I'm working with who wants me to write a book strictly for kindergarten to grade 8 on critical thinking skills that are kind of universal, they're standard. Because the more we've been talking about what will the future look like, the more we're convinced that it's way more difficult to try to convince adults to change their views than to teach the younger children. It's the same with when learning a language. You can learn a lot more easily when you're young than you can when you're older. We're thinking if we can lobby successfully some of the ministers of education in the future to put a program in place throughout at least Ontario, or at least parts of Ontario, and then to do a longitudinal study to follow how that moves, how those children move with those skills through the education system, I think we'll be on a lot surer footing of the efficacy or lack thereof. It could turn out that no, it doesn't matter if you teach them critical thinking skills. But I think we have an obligation to at least try to get students to learn these skills and then to use them in all of their courses, from English to humanities to civics to the sciences. Critical thinking weaves itself through all disciplines and all subjects. So that's what makes me optimistic, is that I'm hopeful that we can get these programs brought into the elementary school system, certainly before I perish as a human, and that's what keeps me optimistic. So and I have to be, or I think I'd go mad.
All right. Dr. Dicarlo, do we have time for a couple more?
Sure.
All right. Chuck, did I see you trying to raise your hand during the last one?
Can you hear me at all?
Yes, we can.
Oh, great. Chris, I just a couple of things. First,
Can you raise your voice?
I'm sorry, what was that?
Can you raise your voice? Your voice was very low.
Okay, how about that?
It's a bit better.
That bit better, okay. Yeah, Chris, just an example of myself. I'm a retired engineer now. Back in the 70s, Von Daniken, I suppose you all remember him. Well, I have to say I fell hook, line, and sinker with it. And being a technologist and so on, I was reading virtually everything that kind of amplified his theories until, believe it or not, it was Playboy, the Playboy interview. Timothy Ferris interviewed Von Daniken. And I thought, oh, great, more stuff for being, the UFO guy.
Yeah.
And And Timothy tore him apart, literally tore everything apart.
Wow.
That Von Daniken tried to do. It was great. But the first thing it did, it really pissed me off. Why did he do that to my hero?
Yes.
You know, but after 2 or 3 readings of the interview, I realized, you know, the science behind what Timothy said was valid. And all this other stuff was all, you know, I realized the science was a bit weak, but, you know, I still went along with it. So to me, this is the example of going from a conspiracy to, you know, into the reality, tricks people into reading the opposite, I guess.
That's good. That's good. You know, that's very interesting. You know, it's good, first of all, that people read Playboy for the articles.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, because it was, a lot of people don't realize this. Norman Mailer wrote for Playboy. Like, a lot of people don't realize that. There's very good journalistic articles written in that magazine. There's no question about it. And that's how you came by that. That's interesting. Great story.
I have a quick question for you as well,
Sure.
if you don't mind.
Mm-hmm.
About 10 years ago, you were in Ottawa for the 8th Humanist AGM.
Okay.
And if you remember, the theory was then we're all from Africa, or we're
Yep.
all Africans.
Yep.
And during that time, you described the situation you were having, that somebody was suing you because of your ideas. And I never found out what was the conclusion with that. Could you tell us?
Right. Yeah. So basically, it's not so much that they were suing me. It was that they had ideological differences, went to the dean, and I was up for a tenure track position. And she was Aboriginal student who hooked up with 2 fundamentalist Christians. And what happened was, I wrote "We Are All African" on the board, critical thinking class. And I said, if the evolutionary sciences are what they tell us is true, then look around this room. Everyone is related in this room to everyone else. Doesn't matter what our features look like. We all had to have come from Africa. And so the Aboriginal student said, "What about my people?" And I said, "Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of Aboriginal myth, and I'm familiar with a fair bit of it." And she said, "But who's right?" And I said, are you prepared to accept what I'm about to say? And she said, "Yeah, you're the professor." I said, "Well, not your people. You weren't here on this land forever. You migrated from what we now call Russia. And your ancestors came across the Bering Strait. You came down through what is now Alaska, and all of the Americas got populated. And then the last ice age retreated, and everybody was landlocked. Nobody could get there until my ancestors in Europe invented the technology to be able to make it to the Americas, and then didn't realize there would be people there." And she said, "But you're saying they weren't here forever?" And I said, "No, in fact, that's impossible. It's scientifically demonstrably false. But you know what? If you want to bring some elders into the class, and I'll bring some colleagues from the various sciences, this would be a good example of how to discuss, these so-called culture clashes or culture wars, when a group of people see the world one way and another group of people see the world another way. How do we have that conversation?" And the class was very, very much interested in doing this. She was not. So she went to the dean. The dean sent me a registered letter with these complaints. And then that tenure track position went away, and the union said, "No, you can't do that." So we sued them. We won, given a small, cash award. But then I never taught there again, So I was out of a job for doing what I thought was my job, which is, look, I'm not smart enough to figure this out, but people way brighter than me did. So I'm responsibly giving you the information that they discovered about all humanity. It's not mythology, it's not religion, and it's not philosophy that is the great equalizer, folks. It's science. Science figured it out. through DNA analysis of what's known as genetic coalescence, we know for sure, like as for sure as you can be in science, that we all came out of one place and that we are all related. But I was called out on a charge of racism, believe it or not, by saying we are all African. I was being racist against Aboriginal people. And I was being Eurocentric because I used science to prove my point. And that was 2005. And I knew then the handwriting on the wall. That was the origins of the woke movement. How dare you use science? Science is just another narrative. This is what Jordan Peterson goes on about, these postmodernists who just see science as not having any privileged view of the world, but it's just one other perspective. To which I tell postmodernists, yeah, the next time you experience chest pain, give your mechanic a call, because medicine's just another narrative. So what's the difference? Yeah, so that's what happened. We successfully sued, but they don't need a guy like me hanging around there. So I was on to the next university to then get fired from, because I was an atheist. So yeah, it's still optimistic though.
Yeah.
Linda.
I was gonna mention maybe like as you say, the woke movement did do some damage, but I think part of why there's not so many right-wing professors is maybe because the right wing their Overton window has shifted so much to the right that, you know, like whereas before the right wing was more closer to the center, like Steve Harper kind of right wing.
Yeah.
Now they're like Trump right wing. So the right wing is not Stephen Harper anymore. It's frickin' Trump and it's the anti-vaxxers. Like
True.
like there was this site called Rebel Media.
Oh, I'm familiar.
And they had some good points. Yeah, they had some good points on on protecting people's right to criticize Islam, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they're correct in saying that Islam, when you criticize Islam or don't like Islam, that's not racism, because Islam is not a race. It's a religion like Catholicism or Protestantism. But the woke people say, "Oh no, you're being racist." You know, so I signed some of their what do you call it? Some of their protests against these anti-Islamophobia bills, right? I signed that these bills should not come through.
Yeah, right.
Because we should have the right to criticize anyone we please.
Absolutely.
But now when I get things from them, it's all anti-vax stuff.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's like the right wing has become anti-vax. They've become like homosexuality is a choice kind of thing. They've become so anti-science.
Yep, some have. And another problem with that, Linda, is people like me get pushed to the right, even though I'm the most centrist guy you could imagine. Like to me, a good idea is a good idea. I don't care which side it comes from. Is it a good argument? Have you presented a good argument? Are your policies really good for the people? Or are you favoring one group more so than another disproportionately for no relevant reasons? So it's I think in a way it's pushed the centrist rights in the eyes of some of the woke. Everything is far right then. You know what I mean? And even lefties, even some of my lefty professor buddies, for them to just say, well, have we thought about this? And just to raise a possible objection philosophically is to be considered part of the problem. You see, you're not even allowed in some parts of the United States at some liberal arts colleges, you can't even talk about the other side. It's a done deal. And so this is what I call a fascism to the left, when it becomes so, co-opted and people are coerced into constantly driving further and further left, because if you're not value signaling of how left you are, then you can be pointed out as being part of the problem. And it's like the left is eating itself, you know?
Yeah.
And the fringes the fringes are getting way too much attention from the media, which is another problem, because the media is all over this. They love the fringe stuff because that's what gets people to say, what? This Marjorie Taylor Greene is a QAnon advocate. Let's find out what she's all about. Right. And it's just unfortunate.
Like I've had not one but 3 people who I used to know become anti-vaxxer, and it's really scary. Like I remember a time in the 1950s, which was a lot more conservative in the States, and you saw pictures, black and white pictures of people lined up around the block to get a polio shot.
Absolutely.
And these were conservative people. Maybe can I make a suggestion? Instead of calling your course critical thinking, call it skeptical thinking.
That's cool, but it still has that connotation of, oh, you're going to be skeptical about what I believe. So, trust me. And I'm wondering if it was the language itself, critical thinking, right? Argument. Oh, what do you mean? Argument. You know, well, an argument is how you form your ideas. You put them into a form of an argument. Even the term fallacy, I wonder if people are thinking of penises. I don't know. You know, it's
fallacies.
I've thought about trying to change the language, trying to rebrand, and I don't know, why should we be the ones to budge? You know, why should, critical thinking has been around since John Dewey, it's been around for years.
It's like I try to tell people, look, white people have experienced racism too.
I've lost 5 jobs from 4 universities and 1 college for being an atheist. We call that, I guess, atheophobia. But the fact of the matter is, how is that any different from other irrelevant characteristics, skin color or nationality or sex or gender, right? It's no different. It's still wrong. But nobody's marching for, the benefit of those of us who want to champion critical thinking and get fired because of it.
Oh God, I think wasn't it Lawrence University that had George brought a professor in who stood up for a girl, and all she did was a presentation. Remember that one, that big incident where all she did was do a clip of Jordan Peterson. She didn't say she agreed with them or nothing.
That's right.
She said, here's another viewpoint. This is what this person believes. And she got roasted over it, and she tape recorded everything. And
the biggest difference between her and me, I never recorded my private discussions with administrators, and I probably should have. But it was just, you just didn't do that. It was just one of those things. You just didn't do that. So, okay. So it was basically my word against an administrator's. I literally had a vice president tell me at a university, Chris, do you think the reason why you don't have tenure yet at this university is because maybe God doesn't want you to have tenure at this time?
What? Oh my God.
I went to the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario, that one. But could you imagine if I had recorded that and gone to the paper?
Oh, you would have. Oh, man. Yeah, you got to start recording things.
Well, it's too late. It's a little too late. I think the horse has already left the barn there. So.
No, I mean, if you ever have a situation like this in the future, record everything.
I highly doubt, unless there's a dean, that has a spine, that has a few vertebrae, to say, I don't care. I want this guy here. He's white. I don't care. He has a penis. And he wants to teach critical thinking. I'm going to let him, do that. unless there's somebody like that, I'm never, ever going to be at a, you know, I'm never going to get tenure. But
Oh my God.
and U of T was the latest to, you know, because I happened to say in class that, yeah, Jordan Peterson is a colleague of mine, and I agree with some of the things he says. Certainly not all. I think he's a closet Christian. But the fact of the matter is, in the 1970s, Peterson we would have been considered boring. We would have been mainstream compared to some of the profs that I had in the 80s. If this were the 70s, nobody would be saying anything about what Peterson is talking about. But those days are gone. And I don't know if we're ever going to get them back. But
George, I see if your hand up.
A comment, not a question. For the last 15 years or so, I've been using a motto which says, think critically for yourself. And then it offended someone, my sister-in-law. And basically, it was one of these things that I never understood on what ground, but it just really broke everything and all respect between us and so on. So why this think critically for yourself was thought to be interesting. Well, I think critically for myself. Why do you have to tell me to think critically for myself? when it was simply a motto on my on basically some of my social media at the time, Gmail, Google Talk or whatever that was prominent at the time, and I still use it at the bottom of my emails. No, but that seemed to have triggered before the word triggered was known.
Yeah, that's so odd though. Like, I find it so inoffensive.
Yeah.
You know, it's just such good advice.
Anyway.
Yeah. At the very least, it raises creates a conversation, you know, something to talk about. That's good.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah.
Okay, supplementary, unless somebody has, I have a supplementary one.
Go ahead, George.
Okay. All the suggestions about how to teach critical thinking were kind of stated in, let's say, a Western European, North American context, and so on and so forth.
Yep.
And, or even I should say, in a country where it is presumed to be democratic.
Right.
How is it that these kind of ideas can be made to penetrate where the concept of free speech is not, is a luxury?
Yeah, yeah, no, it's a great question. I've spoken to Chinese dignitaries. I've traveled to Guatemala. I've done Skype teaching to Ghana, Nigeria, and some of my work was translated and smuggled into Iran. So we're trying to do as much as we can internationally, but it's just it's so difficult, right? I mean, it's just there's so many hoops you have to jump through, and it's very, very complicated.
If somebody offers to translate to you in other language, do you allow them, or did you ask for, I don't know, what's
No, I told them to go ahead.
So if somebody asks you to translate it into Arabic, you'd be interested in that, I assume.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
Right. Maybe it's, I think it's getting kind of late for everyone. Do we have maybe one final question? Yes, Chuck?
Quickie, when people ask me if I'm an atheist after our conversation, I say I'm a pragmatic realist. That's my answer.
Very good. I like that.
All right. Well, I'm not seeing any more. So I think if everyone could come off mute and give a big round of applause.
Thanks, Dr. Dicarlo.
Yes, thank you so much.
Very good, Dr. Dicarlo.
Thank you.
And thank you everyone for the excellent questions and conversation.